Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Cricket8 Podcast. I'm on half of today's episode, Machel St. Patrick Hewitt, and to my left, to my right, depending on where you are watching this, is of course Jarrod Kimber. And we're here on a Friday, ready to have another robust conversation. Jarrod doesn't really, well, he kind of knows what I'm going to talk about, but I
never know what you're going to talk about, mate.
Neither do I, to be fair. But this episode, Jarrod, starts with this particular tweet that I saw 3 days ago on ESPN, Cricket Info. And the tweet read... Well,
I already know you're going to hate it because I know how much you hate Cricket Info.
No, but it's...
Your irrational, unnatural hatred for Cricket Info, where you will simp for Crick Buzz and you will slag off Cricket Info, is one of the more hilarious things about you as a human being.
Listen. This one's not even necessarily having a go at Crick Info. It came on my timeline, and I was like, Oh, okay, interesting. Is there a scope for this argument? So it was an extract from an article written by Sid Monger, and it said it's. Hold on, the phone's ringing there. 1 second.
Is that Sid calling now to go, Mash? Told you before. Stop. Get your name. Get your name out of my.
And anyways, the quote said out of the article, it simply took India batters too long to realize they don't need to score all the runs individually. And that was like a quote. And then the headline of the article was, India aren't the perfect T20 international team, but they might be the greatest ever. And then the sub headline is, the only gap in their lineup is bowlers with the ability to hit sixes, and that's something they might have to live with for the moment. Now, I'm not trying to say maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know if that's a Crick Info clickbait type of headline, but I did look at it and I thought, okay, am I reacting to this because I've just always assumed that general consensus is that the West Indies team of 2012 to 2016, and I completely accept that I may well have West Indian tinted glasses on here, but I just assumed the given take was, well, West Indies had the best T20 team, and if they aren't, they're certainly the trailblazers in the format. Where do you stand, Jarrod? Having taken in that T20 series between India and England, is there merit in saying India might be the greatest ever T20 international side? So that was balanced, Jarrod. Over to you.
It's too early to say that they're the best, but if you're asking of what team could be the best, then they have the ability to score 250 to 320 against a good team. And I don't think the West Indies did, right? Like, that's not the West Indies' fault. The game has just developed since the West Indies played, right? Like, we remember the West Indies for all their hitters. We forget the amount of times Marlon Samuels was 25 not out of 32 balls, knocking the ball around, right? We forget the Lendl Simmons innings, mate, when we go back. And we also forget that there was a lot of ropey bowling, right? There was a lot of Carlos Brathwaite and Darren Sammy and Kyron Pollard. And, you know, so there were things within that team that at times were a little bit not as strong, right? For its period, like, they should have won all 3 World Cups, West Indies. You know, and they didn't always have their best players playing. Sunil Narine didn't play in 2016, did he? He was on the outs with the board at that stage. So they should have been even better than they were. I think what Monga is trying to say, based on what you just read out anyway, I think what he's trying to say is that this is a team that can bat to number 8, number 9 sometimes if they wanted to. They could even bat further. They could basically just pick Bumrah and a bunch of all-rounders, right? If they really wanted to push it that far. They could score at a scoring rate that we've only ever seen in league games, right? So, you know, the Sunrisers and those kinds of teams. They could score at that kind of rate. And then they have this incredible interchangeable all-rounder option, right? So they have Hardik and Nitesh Kumar Reddy. And then they have Akshar, Jadeja's retired, but they have Akshar, Washington Sundar, all available to give them multiple different kinds of spin options. And then they have three frontline bowlers in Jasper Bumrah, who might be the best white ball bowler of all time.
Mhm.
Mohammad Shami, who's a really good new ball bowler, and Kuldeep Yadav, who's a fantastic wrist spinner who can move it in both directions. As Monga says, there aren't many weaknesses in that. I wrote about this in when was the Australian World Cup? Was that 2023, I think? Or 2022?
2022, yeah, 2022.
So I wrote about it then. So I was 3 years ahead of Monga going, if you look on paper what India can do, they can create a T20 side unlike anything we have ever seen before. But there's a big difference between that and knocking, a broken England side around and doing it consistently and winning all the time. And I think, Rob Barron's talked about this a lot. They're only a Bumrah injury away before you don't really trust their bowling anymore, right? Like it's not quite. Do you remember when Shane Warne was injured and Australia still steamrolled their way through? So not even injured, suspended for drugs, and Australia still won the next 2 World Cups without Shane Warne playing in them, right? I think at the moment, if you were to take out Bumrah, you would look at that and go, "Oh, it's a bit thinner than I thought it was." But outside of that, they do have like multiple options. I mean, their biggest problem at the moment is they don't know whether Tilak Varma should bat at number 3 or Sky should bat at number 3. Like that again. That's the position that probably Marlon Samuels and Lendl Simmons were, sort of vying for in the peak West Indian side. So that's an upgrade on that position. But you also don't have that sort of Darren Sammy, Carlos Brathwaite type player as well, right? They don't have that sort of person who could probably play as a frontline bowler when their bowling is holding up. But can also just hit sixes for fun at the end. Even someone like Hardik, he's probably more of a regular batter. So he's right. They're missing that sort of thing at the other end, which I suppose, did Ramdam bat at number 9 in the World Cup final in 2016? I want to say was, if I remember back, like
in the team, but I don't remember how many at bats even. I don't think he had to bat much.
Well, the point being is I think they used him as insurance batting, right? So you had the position to go back, a step further there. So I think they're like for like sides in many ways. I think India just have more options than maybe the West Indies had. Maybe not as reliant on a couple of players, but West Indies won 2 World Cups and India has won 1 World Cup at the moment, right? Like we're a long way from that. But I think if you go through the last few years, India probably should have already won a couple of World Cups. And this is the kind of team I've been saying they should have. Go back to that 2022 World Cup. I wrote the piece. It's the longest piece I've ever written. It's probably about 30,000 words going through of how, if you look at India, this is the way they should be playing. And they are now playing that exact way. Should be pointed out that when I wrote that piece, Rahul Dravid, I should say, it was on YouTube. When the piece went up on YouTube, Rahul Dravid looked at it and he disagreed with me. And then he put the team together pretty much exactly as I said. I'm like, that's one for me, Rahul. That's one for me. That's all right. But the point being is, I think a lot of us, Jimenez was their analyst, Rahul was there, some of their assistant coaches as well. Anyone kind of watching knew this was the team they should be building towards. And now that they have it, I think that the other important thing is what Sid said before. The West Indies, and I think this is because of the Trini boys, and it'd be interesting to get your views on this. The West Indies worked out that T20 cricket was a different format before anyone else did, right? Yeah. And that's because the Trini boys played win ball, and in win ball, facing 15 balls and hitting 4 sixes was more important than making 35 of 28, right? Like it just was. And so they understood T20 cricket before anyone else in world cricket did, and that went through the West Indies camp really, really quickly. I think what you are seeing now is a whole generation of Abhishek Sharmas and Tilak Varmas, and even someone like Sky who have worked out what T20 cricket is. And so they are playing it in that method and in that mode. And that's what Monga's talking about. It's not the old days of like, Rishabh Pant's really good. Let's teach him how to be an anchor. It's like these new guys may not even look at cricket from that perspective anymore because they are willing to be like, no, well, my job is to do this. But the difference that they have compared to, say, an England side is that if you look at the English side is they will attack, but with no brains, right? They won't think, let's give them 4 overs, then we'll take them down. England just attacks. Whereas if you look at some of the games that India beat England recently on, they geared back down and then still went on to win the game by still attacking. So that's the perfect situation. That's what you want, right? You want, Kane Williamson, in the bed and Glenn Maxwell in the kitchen. Do you know what I mean? Like that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that ability to be able to do that, and the Indians at the moment have that within them. But that's the tricky bit. And the West Indies had trouble with this as well. You know, a lot of those games you and I remember when they lost, West Indies would just go too hard because they hadn't just worked out that they only needed to gear down for a couple of minutes. And I thought they became a much better side towards 2016, that towards a 2015, 16, 17 period when they went to themselves, no. We actually don't always need to be at 10. We can come down to 5 because when we go to 10, no one else can. And I've been looking at this Indian side and I reckon there's an element of that as well. Did that answer your question?
It did. And interestingly enough, up until the 2024 World Cup win, because and you've rightly pointed out, they didn't have the titles to justify claims. Obviously, they've won in 2024. We've got another World Cup next year. I've always kind of looked at India's lack of titles and said, so what's the IPL doing? Because obviously the Indian players don't play anywhere else. They're only in the IPL. Yeah. So that doesn't mean I'm now going to flip my argument and say, well, clearly then the IPL is reaping the rewards for India. But I guess what I'd say is why, and it's possibly a wrong correlation to make, why hasn't the IPL reaped rewards sooner for India, or was it benefiting other teams first?
I think it always benefits. Yeah, I mean, I think let's go back in history. Here's a little history lesson on West Indies cricket. I reckon West Indies got more out of county cricket in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and league cricket than England did, right? And that's because for the West Indies, it was their second or third jobs, right? They already had to be good to make it to the West Indies. Then they had to work out how to play in England. And then a lot of them would also go on to play, you know, club cricket in places like, you know, Australia, maybe even shield cricket in some cases in places like Australia. That meant that they were very well-rounded cricketers, right? The Indian cricketers are not as well-rounded anymore because they don't get the opportunities of being the jet setters, right? So the early part of IPL, that makes sense. When you get to a certain point, though, who's benefiting more out of county cricket now, the West Indies or England?
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because eventually professionalism matters, right? And the fact that these players in India have access to things that the other players from around the world don't have access to. What was it? Was it 16 people were traveling with Virat? Like I'm just, Chris Gale had a hell of a posse, man. He didn't have 16 people, right? Like he might have had 16 people going to a nightclub with him. He didn't have 16 people going on tour with him, right? And so you've got a very different kind of worldview there. Of it's like I don't know if you are much of a tennis fan, but there was that point where the tennis players started getting older and older, the number ones. The top 20 in the world started getting older and older. And everyone's like, oh, what's changed? And it's like, well, and the other professionals were like, well, they have 18 coaches traveling with them and making sure that their diet is correct and that their emotional well-being is correct. And the tennis players who are ranked 120 in the world are traveling on their own and restringing their rackets, right? Like there's a big difference between those different levels. And so I think we're getting to that kind of level with Indian cricket. I also think that the IPL, largely through the sub rule, which I think is a bad rule overall, and I think they'll eventually make it much better, but it's also probably allowed for a format of cricket that you can't play in all the other leagues in the world, right? Okay. In all the other leagues, you've got to worry about, your weak fifth bowler and your seventh batter who's probably not all that good. So you are batting in your mind with the thought of, I can't lose a wicket here because at number 7 I've got Ben Cutting, and I don't know if Ben Cutting should be in before the 14th over, right? Whereas, was it Rinku Singh basically didn't face a ball for KKR last year, right? Like one of the best hitters in the world is just like, he's so far down the order, they never got that far down. And so that gives it a certain freedom. But I also think there's just a new generation. And, Ashwin's talked about this quite a lot. And it's quite interesting listening to him talk about it. But how they are clearly talking about it, as to get back to what the West Indies did before, in a different way. And you listen to Ricky Ponting talk about T20 cricket, and he could not sound more like a dinosaur. Right? Like everything he says is, if we could rein this guy in, if we could rein this guy in. And it's like, what would Ricky Ponting be saying to Abhishek Sharma? You could be the best anchor in the world, mate. Like we could get you averaging 45. And Abhishek Sharma's like, yeah, but if I average 28 of 12 balls, we'll probably win a lot more games. And so I think all those things have sort of come together a little bit. But the other thing is, and this was always the big issue with all the subcontinental sides is they were so limited by the kinds of people they kept picking, right? Like from the same kinds of schools, from the same kinds of districts, from the same kind of clubs. Now, the IPL has opened that up, right? And suddenly, the same thing's already starting to happen in the PSL. We might get the same thing in Bangladesh as well. Rather than everyone having to come from Dhaka, right? Players will come from, and that doesn't, you might get an MS Dhoni or someone every now and again, but now you are getting people who are getting picked based on their talent and their athleticism. Whereas before, family connections played a part. The school that you went to played a part. I mean, you live in England. I don't need to explain these things to you, right? Like, you know, even in the West Indies, we all know a cricketer of equal talent from Barbados and from, I don't know, Grenada, much more likely to play international cricket if you're from Barbados, because you're going to have access to more training, but also all the people who matter are going to see you. Desmond Haynes is going to tell everyone how good you are, right? Whereas the Grenada, it's like, you know, unless Junior Murray comes in from the pub, from the runner shop one day and watches you, no, there's no one to even talk you up, right? All those things matter. And so you get this sort of groundswell of things. And the one last thing I would say is I think that the T20 cricket specifically, if you go back and look at the great Indian players of previous generations, they were probably not great athletes, right? Whereas Hardik Pandya and Jadeja and many of the other players they've got now, these are athletes, right? Like they are stacked in some cases. They're incredibly flexible and strong. And so we saw that happen with Australia, right? And we probably saw that happen with the West Indies before. Great athletes, especially in limited overs cricket, are so important. And so you unleash that kind of athleticism and things change again.
One thing I noticed about the Indian side, and I give it the caveat of saying that I need to pull all the stats properly for all sides. But Rob Barron and myself had a conversation a few months back, maybe the back end of last year, over whether T20 cricket was experiencing an age crisis. And I think the premise I was trying to put to Rob was that it seems that players, a lot of, like when you look around the different leagues, not necessarily completely, I wouldn't necessarily say that this ties to IPL, but when you look around a lot of the leagues, a lot of the best players or marketable players are all like mid to late 30s or certainly early 30s. And I was like, are we going to experience an age crisis in T20 cricket where actually the young talent coming through aren't as marketable or don't have that kind of franchise star power that we're used to? So I looked at India's squad in this that was picked for this England series, and I saw Dhruv Jurel 23, Rinku 27, Abhishek 24, Tilak 22, Washington 25, Nitish 21, Arshdeep 25, Harshit 23, Ravi Bishnoi 24, right? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I guess what I tried to equate from that is, and I did a quick summation of the West Indies team in my mind, and I was like, we don't have a team that young, or we don't have that amount of young talent coming through. And I guess the question that came into mind was, are India better than other nations at identifying young, specifically T20 talent to come through? But then I thought, but then England have your Bethels and your so on and your so forth. But then I don't know if that goes back to your point about, but England are so scattergun with their approach of how they're playing T20 that maybe the age thing, you can't even make that reference. Do you think India are better at identifying younger talent? And does younger talent matter in this format of the game?
No, I don't think it does. I think what you probably noticed before is that sort of, I just think there has been a push towards older cricketers, right? So cricket has had a history with older cricketers. Wilfred Rhodes played like 1 billion years, right? You know, Graham Gooch, we both grew up with Graham Gooch still hanging around probably, right? Like, you know, there were older cricketers who played up until recently, right? You know, Misbah, even Brad Hodge and Brad Hogg, right? Like, we have had it. And I do think now there is, like in the past, you would get to, 33, 34, and you play a couple of bad games, and we'd never see that old player again. They'd be given the golden handshake. It's very hard to do that with social media, because if that player's popular, good luck being the person who gets rid of them, right? But more importantly, we have seen, as I said before, you know, through tennis, through the NFL, all these different sports are finding, and LeBron James is like 83 years old. they've found a way to elongate themselves. So I think you will see more players of talent in all professional sports sticking around longer than ever before. I'm still shocked that AB de Villiers retired. And I know why he did, and I understand his reasoning now, but I didn't at the time because I was like, you've got 3 more years of kicking people's asses before you become an average player, let alone a good player, right? But so I think you will get that. I think specifically what you've seen here is that India have kind of 2 different eras that have kind of overlapped a little bit. The players who are probably 27, 28, 29, 30, which is KL Rahul, maybe Sanju Samson. I don't know. Shreyas Iyer might be a little bit younger than that, but Shreyas Iyer is kind of in that. Have not done a Richie Richardson or a Michael Clark. They haven't come up so that they're perfectly timed to take over. There's question marks about them, right? They're still star players and they might still go on to be very, very good, but there's question marks about them. Whereas if you look at, Abhishek Sharma and Tilak Varma and Jaiswal, right? If you look at them coming through, very different, right? Jaiswal's not even in this side. He might be he is the best young prospect in all world batting, and he's not actually in this side at the moment. It tells you how many players are coming through, and I think sometimes you just get a generation like that. How old are you, Mash? You're like my age, aren't you? You're a little bit younger than me. You're like 40?
Same age.
Yeah. So when the Australians came through, you had this period of time so Australia lost the 92 World Cup, which has never not been hilarious to me when you look at the players that they had available to them. But if you go back, they were still picking the players that they thought should be in the ODI side. And within 4 years, even with a little bit of tweaking, they'd become a very different side. And by 99, they'd completely taken over. But if you look at between 93 and 96, the players that were coming through, it was Hayden, Langer, Ponting, Blewett, Martin, all came through in that period, right? Like almost one after the other would come through. And you couldn't even fit them all in the side because Australia had who are you going to drop? Are you going to drop Mark Waugh? Are you going to drop David Boone, who won a World Cup in 1987? Like, are you going to drop Steve Waugh, who, when his hamstring works, is still one of the better? Or do you know what I mean? There were players everywhere to the point at which when they had the Australia A game, I don't know if you know about this, but Australia A played a series against Australia, and they would have beaten them. But Australia was so worried that they pulled Paul Rifle out to be 12th man in the main team, so they didn't have to go up against them. And that Australia A team, like that changed everything. That's the sort of generation we might be seeing with India now, where it's not that the players in and around, it's not that those other players don't deserve, more game time and everything else, but this other generation might just kind of blow through them a little bit. And within the space of like 1 to 2 years, and then you've got, Virat and Rohit have already retired from T20 cricket, right? So that has opened up 2 spots. You might get a few other players doing something similar as well. And then you'll get a couple of players like Jaiswal who might just force their way in. Like, I don't even know where you fit Jaiswal on this side at the moment, right? But someone like Gill, who 5 years ago, you would have just said, well, you just pencil Gill in to be your opener in T20 cricket. They might just go, well, he doesn't actually even play the style of T20 cricket we want anymore. We want this, and we've got 2 or 3 other options available to us to be able to do those roles. So things can change that quickly when you have that sort of a generational pool coming through. And that might, again, to go back to your original point, might be linked to the IPL, right? Like that there's an influx of talent. And it'll be interesting to see if we see that in other countries as well. Like these, we think of England as the country with the class-based cricket culture, right? Because it's so forced down our throat. But outside of Australia, most countries have a class-based cricket culture. Australia or the West Indies were the 2 that somehow managed to get around it eventually. In Australia's case, it almost never existed. And in West Indies' case, it was hard to, once the black players essentially were so much better than the white players, like it maybe just ate itself, right? But every other country, New Zealand has a class-based structure, right? And if you go back and you listen to the old players from the subcontinent, they're quite often very well educated from the right kind of families. There's still a lot of great players in that list. They were very good white West Indian players as well. But what you want to be able to do is open it up to everyone. And so suddenly you get a very different kind of playing field when a kid from some village that you've never heard of might be the next big star. And that's probably why one of the reasons Australia's been so good is that ability to find a cricketer in literally the outskirts of Australia that doesn't even have any any coverage. And then that's the next, that's what Glenn McGrath and Don Bradman both come from places that, like, I've never been to them. I've got no, do you know what I mean? If you ask me to say where they are on a map, Mash, I'd be like, they're roughly in New South Wales, the two places they're from. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know they're in New South Wales, but I wouldn't know how to drive to either of those places. And I think Josh Hazelwood's another one. Not all cricket cultures have always been good at that. You look at Sri Lanka, and it's like the vast majority of their batters come from two schools, right?
Yes,
so, are you telling me those are the only two schools that have ever worked out how to teach people how to bat? It seems really unlikely to me. And so does the IPL explode that sort of stuff? And then let's just say that you or I was working for an IPL franchise, yeah? How are we going to stand out from everyone else? Well, it's not looking at the under 15 or under 17 national sides, right? Those players are already on pathway to play for the IPL. It's going into a regional place and literally, seeing if you could see a guy bowls at 85 miles an hour and is 15 years old, or a 22-year-old with a weird action, or a guy that seems to swat every spinner for 6 in the nets. Do you know what I mean? That's kind of what we're looking for, in a way that wasn't what Indian cricket was looking for before. So in a country of 1.3 billion, if you open up the talent pool, don't you change everything?
So if we go back and we pivot back then to the start, and this is probably a nice way to kind of end this particular episode. So Sid Munger argues that this could be the greatest T20 national side. And with the World Cup next year in mostly Sri Lanka, but obviously India as well, it stands to reason that everyone would expect India to be the natural favourites to win that World Cup. Who would, at this point, it may not be the same answer a year from now, Jarrod, but who at this point would you say would be the best placed international side to beat India? Who would be the best place for you if you look at how they're structured and how they're going about their business, that you could say, I could see them winning a World Cup and maybe beating India in a final if that's what it came down to?
Yeah. India, I think I looked this up the other day because it's quite funny. I think India are already a shorter favourite in that tournament than they are in the Champions Trophy.
Right.
So people are just like, people have watched them play in the last couple of weeks and be like, I don't know about their one-day cricket. They might be good. But in T20, they're like, no, they're already great. They'll be fine. Look, I think Australia could do some very interesting things. I don't know if, sort of Josh Brown and Mitch Owen, what's his name? Jake Fraser-McGurk. Australia probably has players who can score at similar kinds of rates to India. And then they also have genuine all-round prospects, right? Like, Bo Webster's sort of blown through the door. I don't know if Cooper Connolly would be ready for that, but, there's a lot of people in Australia that tell me I underrate Cooper Connolly and he's the next big star coming through. You've got, Cameron Green will eventually work out how to bowl in T20 cricket. Like, at very least, he should be as good as Carlos Brathwaite's bowling, right? And he's got a much higher upside as a batter than Carlos Brathwaite. So, and then you've got the sort of, Aaron Harney and Mitch Marsh, if he ever has a hamstring or a back ever again. So they have the ability to put together a very, very interesting destructive side. Whether it is, but by the time India get to that World Cup, this is the advantage with India. They've already been playing a lot of their young players. So a lot of them are very experienced. They've now played in a few different places. And by that next World Cup, they're going to know more or less who their best 13 players are. And then they will be hoping that Shami or Bumrah stays fit and that Arshdeep steps up or Siraj comes back to form, right? I think they need one of those things, that combination of things to happen. But I don't see that many other, I've watched a lot of the SA20. South Africa's an interesting side. I still want to see, Heinrich Klaassen hasn't made any runs recently. David Miller's going to be 100 years old by the time they get there for that tournament, right? They kind of need those two to be in their peak. And their top order is still not quite as sexy as some other places. England, I just don't know how anyone could ever back England on any pitch where it's going to spin. And then you tell me who's the next best side. West Indies is 12 to 1 to win that tournament.
No, see, I didn't even mention West Indies.
They are, though. West Indies are currently the fifth favourite for that tournament, right?
Yeah, but I understand that, in fairness. I actually get that, only in the sense of...
If you've never seen the West Indies play.
No, I get that. I get that in the sense they've overcome the slump since all of the goats stepped away.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're brilliant, but then we definitely overcome that slump era that we were in. But a lot was
just riding Akil Hassan to victory. No, look, but I think that shows you that it's a bit open. So, South Africa has. I don't know if you've seen the young guy Luhandre Pretorius. I hope I've pronounced that right. I've been practicing for hours, but I mean, he's the big cherub-faced kid who just whacks it. They've got a couple of young kids. Obviously, they've got Dylan Brevis. Tristan Stubbs suddenly looks like the player that Tristan Stubbs
was going to be,
hinted at when he was young, right? I think obviously they're going to need replacements in the spin pot. I don't think Shamsi will. I think that's a tournament too far from Shamsi, watching him of recent times. But Bjorn Fontaine is a good backup for Maharaj. Like, they've got some really good talented players there. Again, though, like, I don't see anything at the moment that's going to... I think the Australian team is the one that is, if everything went correct, right, it's quite an exciting side for that World Cup. I still don't see it at India's level, though.
The only thing I would say, and this is my final point, just because you've mentioned Australia, is for that Australian side to be what you think they could be, they've got to kind of go all in now. Like, I don't see how much longer they could wait to suddenly say, okay, let's roll the dice on these young guys and so on and so forth. Like, and that's where I think you're right to say India already start a huge advantage because they've started the process before. I look at everyone else's teams and I'm like, they're still undecided about who's in and what the what the style of play is and who are the locked in 9 and so on and so forth. Whereas with India, you could probably write their 13-man squad or 15-man squad now.
Exactly. And I think you look at someone like, Brown and Mitch Owens, who I mentioned before. Like, Owens has just gone to the SA20 and not made a run. Right. Fraser McGurk has not really made runs since that IPL season. Right. But we know, I think the only thing with them is they have a ceiling that is on that sort of level of India where you're just like, how can you bowl to these guys? Like, they're going to try and hit 20 runs on over off us. With very good veterans and other players around as well. So I think Australia has an interesting one, but it could also be that it all falls apart if they chase that dream. This is the thing. Beating India at the moment is setting up to beat India is maybe the best way of putting it, is a really difficult conversation to have because you need players who are good enough against spin to handle it. You need players who are good enough against... Like, Glenn Maxwell is one of the best T20 players of all time. Have you ever seen Maxwell play Bumrah? Right? Like, it's a shit show, right? It doesn't work, man. And so... it's very hard to, if you want to have all these T20 specialists, and I think that's the difference. You watch Abhishek Sharma against Jofra Archer, and you're like, he's a T20 specialist, but he's a T20 specialist in a way that looks very repeatable. Whereas I think the Australian, and we're seeing it with England at the moment, their versions are a little bit more combustible, right? It's a little bit more slogging. And that's one reason why I kind of like the South African option, but I'm just not sure they're quite going to be ready by that stage. So if you're betting on India to win a World Cup or an ICC tournament, I'd bet on the T21 before the Champions Trophy.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that's been another episode of the Cricket8 Podcast, and we have definitively answered Sid Monger's postulation. India are the greatest T20 international team of all time. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Cricket8 Podcast. But for now, thank you. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe on your way out if you haven't already done so. And see you all very, very soon.
Remember to support us by subscribing and sharing, but also signing up at cricket8.com, where live scorecards cover 8,000 matches a year with advanced visual details that tell you who is actually in front in the game.